Ace Attorney. A cult classic mystery comedy series following Phoenix Wright and Company. There's a lot the series boasts in its popularity. From stupid names to moments that feel surreal even for a courtroom satire, it's a franchise that's got it all. But something you may have noticed after its years of continuation, there's a similarity in the way the games play out. Similar types of cases, similar themes, you name it. What Ace Attorney is doing here is using formula fiction. At its simplest, formula fiction is the use of recurring storylines. With this formula in place, there are many other things that come as a result, but I would like to demonstrate them by first using an example, other than Ace Attorney, of course. Ever heard of Pokemon? Well, if you have ever played a Pokemon game, then there's a single question I can ask you that, no matter which game you've played or which game you choose as your subject for this question, you will answer the same way no matter what. The question is this. Describe the story. Here, I can do it for you. I'm thinking of one of the games, and this is how the general story goes. You play as a child, who leaves home with a starter Pokemon with the intention of becoming the new league champion. Along the way, you battle the gym leaders to earn badges, and must stop an evil team with questionable intentions to get to your goal. You end up catching a legendary Pokemon, and then go on to defeat the champion. Which game did I just describe to you? Whatever game you just guessed was the right answer, as they all follow this storyline, no matter which way you look at it. This is the essence of formula fiction, which in its proper definition refers to storylines that are reused or repurposed to the point of predictability. Typically, it is seen as something to criticize, cited as a lack of originality in a work. However, formula fiction doesn't immediately mean a series is unoriginal. There are a few reasons that a series might use it. For example, it can be used to create series expectation. Series expectation is the phenomenon that as a series goes on, people predict that with each new installment of the franchise, the story will be the same, or similar to the stories that have preceded it. In the case of Pokemon, it works in a way that keeps each new game familiar. You always know the basic steps of the story, and then you can focus on the little details of the new region, like locations, characters, and any new Pokemon. This can be said for any series. The sense of familiarity makes room for writing to include finer details, and then lets the players focus on the niche aspects of new installments. Of course, this can be a double-edged sword. It's possible that installments will become too similar, run together, and players won't see the value in additions to the franchise as nothing new is being made, just recycled. In this state, a series has fallen into stagnation. Falling into stagnation can be curtains for a series. If no one wants to play, no one wants to buy. And if there just isn't the wow factor bringing the crowd back, there's no point in continuing. You have to do something to save the series from getting to this point if you want success. So how do you save a series from stagnation? Subversion. Anyone who has played Pokemon extensively knows that the series underwent changes after the 4th generation of games. In the 5th generation, the story was overhauled with an evil team that's intentions conflicted with the players to the point they seemed less like villains, more like heroes. You don't beat the champion to beat the game, and there are no Pokemon from previous games present. These changes were a subversion to the previous games. All subsequent games in the series use subversion to keep the games new and interesting. The 6th generation was the first to use 3D graphics and introduced the Mega Evolution mechanic. The 7th gen changed the league system from gym leaders to trial captains and kahunas, and included a fake-out evil team that is actually being controlled by a stronger, much more morally grey team. The 8th generation introduced stadiums and the socially active aspect of the challenge to beat the champion, as well as the Dynamax mechanic. These subversions are all major overhauls to the storylines presented in the first 4 generations, whilst still managing to stick to the formula set. There's a system that I'm explaining here. You have a series with the formulaic story for your games. This sets up series expectation. Over time, your formula becomes predictable, damaging that expectation, which causes the series to stagnate. To combat this, new games in the series subvert series expectation with new and exciting content that keeps players invested and happy to keep the series going. Well, that system seems pretty alright, yeah? Keeps things in line and a series can continue without much issue. Well, any look at a review of Pokemon Sword and Shield would overhaul that statement quite quickly. The most recent games have been critically bashed for lacking interesting storylines and focusing on game mechanics over delivering something worthwhile to play. Eventually it becomes evident that people believe this about Pokemon. The new games aren't about keeping people entertained and telling an interesting new take on the predictable storyline we all know and love. It's about making money. There are a lot of issues that come up when formula fiction is involved. To be true, if the series has reached a point of stagnation, it is doomed from there on out. It's only a matter of time before the ideas stop flowing, and a series will have to shut down. On the other hand, the ideas may continue, but there's a high chance they won't hit the mark and the audience won't enjoy it, much like what's happened with Pokemon. Pokemon is just one example of my thesis today. Formula fiction, used for an extended period of time, can have negative repercussions on games and their franchises. Consistently avoiding stagnation with subversions eventually destroys your series' expectation entirely, and with it, a franchise's reputation and worth as a playable series. So, Pokemon demonstrated my point, but there's another series I would like to dive deep into today, and if you didn't guess that already, that's Ace Attorney. The series currently boasts 6 main series games and 5 spin-off games, making a total of 11. With such a roster, it's ripe for the picking when it comes to formula fiction, and it has fallen into the cycle in a devastating way. I'll be looking most into the main series games, with primary focus on the 4th game, Apologise Ace Attorney. While Dual Destinies and Spirit of Justice hold heavy precedence to be the focus of this analysis, I have a deadline to meet. They are both 30-hour games I have yet to play, and I am a mere mortal. I will refer to them where relevant, but I will be keeping my heaviest analysis on Apologise with reference to the trilogy. The structure here is simple. The trilogy represents the introduction of formula fiction and the buds for series expectation, where Apologise and the further sequels go on to demonstrate the destructive effects of stagnation and subversion. Apologise, being the direct sequel to the trilogy, fell into a trap to remain relevant to the fanbase, which becomes clearer when put under a critical lens. So, let the journey begin at the very start. What is the formula of an Ace Attorney game? Using the Phoenix Wright trilogy as a reference point, a typical Ace Attorney game includes the following, in typically the following order: a tutorial case, a story-heavy case, a filler case or multiple, and a finale case. Each case archetype can be defined by the following features. A tutorial case always includes an innocent client, and the witness called to testify against them is always the real murderer. There's no investigation segment, and the player is helped by a mentor character or assistant. A story-heavy case usually involves character development for known characters or introduces major characters who will become relevant later on. Usually, if another case is relevant to the finale, it will be brought up at some point in this one. The killer usually has a big link to somebody in the main cast. A filler case has little bearing on the main storyline of the game, and may include details that come up later. Filler cases usually have a very colourful cast of wackos, and there is usually 1 or 2 witnesses you cross-examine before coming up against the real killer in the courtroom. The finale is the culmination of all cases coming together, and is usually pretty difficult to figure out. The killer isn't always obvious, and the defendant may even seem to be the real deal. There is always major character development for main characters in these cases, and ideologies the game presents earlier on are challenged, forcing the player and the main character into a moral dilemma. These are the 4 case archetypes and the rough structure of a game, with certain archetypes being interchangeable, and certain subversions already present within these first 3 games. Using this formula for story consistently across the trilogy builds onto series expectation that whatever game follows Trials and Tribulations will follow the same rough narrative structure, because the formula says it will. So, does Apologise fall into series expectation? The short answer is yes. The structure of Apologise's cases is tutorial, filler, and finale. Apologise was brazen to include 2 filler cases in a game with only 4 cases to play. While you can argue that the 3rd case is also a story-heavy case, it doesn't contribute much to the final storyline. This is, in technicality, a major subversion to the previous games, but a brave and kind of stupid one. But I shouldn't be so open. It would be better to look at these subversions made in Apologise on a case-by-case basis, to deeply understand the root of the issue and why the subversions made wound up destroying stagnation, but the game itself as well. So, let's start at the beginning. Turnabout Trump is the tutorial case of Apologise. It follows the murder of Shadi Smith, who was killed being brained with a glass bottle after winning a game of poker. You at first believe it was just the killer and the victim in the room, only to find there was a witness to the crime who was involved in the game. You find out that the defendant, while losing the final hand, won the overall game, and had been framed by the victim and the witness for a cheat that never happened. You eliminate the possibility that the defendant did the crime, whilst also determining that the witness wasn't responsible either. You determine that a fourth person was responsible, uncover their identity, solve the mystery of who killed Smith, and get your client a not guilty verdict. Given that this is a tutorial case, it should follow the set conventions of the archetype. The entire case stays within the courtroom with no investigation segment, and the client is innocent as all tutorials go. This is all pretty standard stuff. However, the case is laden with elements that also make this a story-heavy case. You are defending Phoenix Wright, the titular character of the previous 3 games. Throughout the trial, there are many details that end up being important to the events that transpire in the finale case, and the killer of this case has an important link with all the main characters. It develops Phoenix's character in relation to how we knew him in the previous game, and introduces important characters such as Trucy and Kristoff. Combining these 2 archetypes isn't a subversion in and of itself, as Trials and Tribulations did this in Turnabout Memories. It introduced Dahlia, who became the game's primary villain, as well as the situation with Diego Armando, and Mia's introduction to being an attorney, whilst primarily being a tutorial that fulfilled all duties it needed to. Trials and Tribulations was extremely successful with its overarching story, so it makes sense that Turnabout Trump would try to mimic these elements to make a strong start for apologise. However, there are a lot of issues that arise because of this, primarily in where setting up the finale is concerned. As we mentioned, there are a lot of details that become relevant to Turnabout Succession, but after looking at it, the details and hints almost seem ham-fisted. Phoenix having a locket with a picture of his daughter in it is important for about 10 minutes in Turnabout Trump, treated like it was important, then dropped completely from this case. It then becomes important during Turnabout Succession when you meet with Shadi Enigma, or Shadi Smith, once more. At the end of the tutorial, Phoenix admits that something that was presented during the trial was forged. Forged evidence is key to the central storyline of the game. However, you never find out what was forged and how it really affects the case at hand. Without the prior knowledge of these things being important later, you can still feel that it will turn out to be important somewhere, but it feels out of place how quickly the topic of the locket is dropped, and how casually Phoenix admits to you that you just presented forged evidence. Within the case context, it doesn't fit well and hurts the story. This is a result of trying to combine a tutorial case with a story-heavy case. As was mentioned, this combination can be done, however, there are faults that occur because of this in Apologise's case. Despite this, the case does stand rather well, being coherent in its unraveling of events and having an interesting premise to unfold. By itself, the case is fine. It's when we look at the rest of the cases in relation to it where the lines become blurred, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, I've spent a lot of time mostly talking about things that are relatively compliant with series expectations, but does Turnabout Trump subvert anything from what is normal? Well, yes. Normally, in a tutorial, the first witness you meet is guilty of the crime, and they are trying to frame your client. However, Turnabout Trump doesn't do this. The witness, Olga Orly, is not the killer, even if she was involved with the events that occurred the night of the crime. It's the real killer that's the subversion. Your mentor, Kristoff Gavin, turns out to be the murderer. What a bombshell. The mentor up until this point has always been helpful and well-meaning, but this turns out not to be the case here. You get to a point in the investigation where you know Olga isn't the killer, but then who is it? Oh, it's this guy. This one. I have a lot to say about this guy, but in the long and short of things, the twist of his being the real killer is pulled off spectacularly. You are meant to doubt it at first because he would never, but then you're cornered. Everything points to one person. It's only for the last piece of evidence to show itself, and you have to accept it very quickly that your trusted mentor isn't who you believed him to be at all. His progression from helpful and always on track with helping your client, to incriminating Phoenix if it means he gets out of this, is abrupt, but fitting for the man who is unhinged in every sense of the word, yet is still trying to play pretend like his life depends on it. This kind of subversion was unexpected, but extremely welcome, as it presents something completely unseen before: a defense attorney as the bad guy. Knowing that Kristoff would go on to become the game's central villain, it's a fitting start to the story. Turnabout Trump has a well-strung combination of predictable elements, as well as its major subversion that throws the theme for the rest of the game. A hopeful start to be true. So, where does it all go from here? Well, let's unpack Turnabout Corner and find out. In Turnabout Corner, you were tasked with a few things. Figure out who hit Mr. Right with a car, where a stolen noodle stand has gone, and to find Trucy's lost magic panties. Along the way you discover a crime scene and are tasked with defending Waki Kitaki, the son of a notorious local mafia family. You're put up to this job by Waki's fiancée, Ali Titiala. In your investigation, you discover that Waki had a botched surgery to rescue a bullet from his heart in a confrontation 6 months ago. The doctor who botched the surgery, Pal Maractus, is the victim, which gives Waki a motive. However, you find out that the nurse of the operation was Ali Titiala herself, who has plenty to hide from the mafia family she is about to join. She is outed as the real killer of Maractus, shooting him from within the stolen noodle stand to silence him about the unknown details of the operation. Turnabout Corner is a filler case through and through, with a wacky cast of characters, a ridiculous subplot about penny thefts, and a witness we cross-examine before going up against the real killer in court. The case as a whole doesn't have much bearing on the overall story, but is still entertaining in its unfolding of events and introduction of many recurring central characters, such as Trucy, Clavia, and Emma. By itself, the case is a little flimsy, but this goes for many filler cases. There are things you can pick out that are flawed, but don't change much in the long run of the story. There are 3 main subversions created in the case, though 2 consist of game mechanics. With the introduction of Emma, we are introduced to forensic minigames, where you investigate the crime scene using forensic techniques, such as fingerprinting and shoe casting. These games are much alike the minigames Emma introduced in Rise from the Ashes, so while they are returning elements, they can be considered subversive, as these mechanics were dropped as soon as Emma was no longer an assistant. The other mechanic is the perceive mechanic, which is Apollo's power, similar to Phoenix and his Cyclops and the Magatama in the trilogy, which, for reference, were locks that appeared on a secret being kept. The subversive element was somewhat introduced in Turnabout Trump, but not the mechanic itself. The mechanic is to isolate a part of someone's testimony, and show that they are lying by pointing out a nervous twitch that they are doing subconsciously when they lie. The source of the ability goes unexplained in this case, but the how comes second to the do. The last subversion is the one that creates an issue. It is simply the fact that the second case of the game is a filler. In the trilogy, all third cases had been filler cases, and though Trials and Tribulations has its second case as a filler, it also is a game with 5 cases, not 4. The issue with this subversion is that it couldn't have been avoided. In the case's inherent writing, it is filler, and it is a second case. Its character introductions and place in the timeline fits, meaning it simply couldn't stand as the third case. It just feels so odd that the only thing we really learn out of the underlying subplot is that forged evidence was to pay for Phoenix's disbarment, and he doesn't like to talk about it. We've nothing else to go off of for the major story. We know after this case is done, there are only 2 more, and since finale cases are always the big head honcho, that means the third case will shoulder much of the remaining hints we need to establish what will happen in the finale. This is extremely concerning when it comes to a certain noticeable trend with third cases. If you don't know what I mean, you will. Enter Turnabout Serenade. In Turnabout Serenade, Apollo and Trucy are invited to a Gavinios concert that is featuring the special guest Lyrebird. In the second act, Lyrebird and Clavia perform the Guitar's Serenade, where some unexpected events occur. In the third act, Lyrebrd's manager, Romain Latouche, is shot, where Emma and Apollo find him. During the investigation, Lyrebrd's musical partner, Marquis Tobaye, is arrested for the murder. This is done in spite of his blindness. In court, Lyrebird claims that she had passed the crime scene during the murder and heard someone with an unknown voice speaking. Her testimony is dismissed in favor of proving the murder couldn't have been committed by someone who was blind, due to somebody wiping blood off the carpet to conceal a bloody number written there, where it is revealed that Marquis isn't blind, but Lyrebird is. Detective Darian, a member of the Gaviniers, was sent to check the Interpol number written on the carpet, where Lyrebird claims that it was his voice she heard at the crime scene when she heard the shots. Without getting into the finer details, it is discovered the murder took place during the second act, Darian and Maki had worked to smuggle an illegal item into the country and were liable for major trouble should they have been found out, resulting in Darian murdering Latouche, who was investigating the operation. Oh, and there was a convoluted subplot about the events of the day of the crime mimicking the lyrics to the guitar serenade, but I wasn't sure how to include that before, so that's also a thing. Considering there was a lot I didn't mention about the case, there is a lot to go over in it, and not all of it is necessarily good. The greatest element to address is the case's archetype. It is predominantly a filler case, however, it juggles story-heavy elements at the same time. It has the generally unrelated story and, if not wacky, interesting cast of a filler case. However, it also possesses the introduction of characters relevant to the finale, specifically Valant Grimmar, as well as catalyzing certain elements that will be relevant in Turnabout Succession, like Phoenix's special mission. It is lacking the development of the main case that leads this case to second the story-heavy elements to the filler elements. Combining these archetypes was brazen for a third case, and if you know, you know. Ace Attorney has an issue with what is commonly referred to as third case syndrome. This term simply means that the third case in the games is usually the weakest link, which can be for a myriad of reasons, from a flimsy story to bad pacing, a bad premise, weak development, and much, much more. By series expectation, you go into Turnabout Serenade expecting the worst. It will have third case syndrome and is likely to be the weakest in the game. And you know what? It is. There is one major thing that drags this case through the gutters when you think about it for more than 3 seconds, that being the premise. We are expected to believe that the police made a reasonable arrest of Maki Tobaye for the murder of Romain Latouche, that they had the evidence to support that he did it. Okay, then let's look at that evidence. So, you're telling me a kid who is presumed blind shot a .45 caliber rifle twice, didn't hurt himself in doing so, escaped through a ceiling vent where he left his fingerprints despite not leaving any on the weapon, hoisted a man twice his size to a stage with a guitar in tow without letting anyone see him, for him to pass out on a platform where he, the body, and the guitar were then lifted in the air. You're telling me that happened? You're telling me the police believe that's what happened? Yeah, by premise alone, there's a lot to unpack in this case, and once it's out, it doesn't fit back in. The issue behind third case syndrome can be attributed to formula fiction quite easily, and it comes from the position of the case in the timeline. The tutorial is the opening to every game, the second case is the next big clincher to keep the momentum going, then momentum can fall in the third case before it gets picked up again by the finale. Apollo Justice made no attempt to truly subvert this aspect of third case syndrome, resulting in it suffering the same fate as was expected. The game knows it's gearing up for the finale, and everyone is waiting for it, it's just a matter of getting through this first. Turnabout Serenade does try to have its subversions though. The murder in the day's events working with the lyrics to the guitar Serenade is an interesting concept, though in places its subplot feels forced into our faces, and at points it is rehashed to death. Still, a good idea to work with. The twist of the murder taking place in the second act and not the third works narratively, but it can feel like a discredit to the rest of the case working under that pretense, similarly to the reveal of Maki not being blind. Again, the idea behind it had good intentions. The villain of the case is also an interesting subversion. Darian Crescend is a police detective in international affairs. The idea of a villain on the police force has a place in subversion. However, his role as a detective isn't made apparent and comes second to his role in the Gaveniers. In Rise from the Ashes, the killer, Damon Gant, was chief of police. Along with most of the characters in that case being on the police force, that case made a point of manipulating themes of police corruption and brutality. But the trait of Darian being a detective is only thought of when it counts. It's otherwise not that important. Where Turnabout Serenade tries to make subversions, they fail in their purpose to keep things interesting. And where things aren't subverted, it festers. Like that premise, am I right? By working in tandem with Turnabout Corner, the case is forced to shoulder a filler archetype as well as a story-heavy archetype, but delivers on only one. The case is an absolute mess, but it's the third case. What else did we expect going into it, really? With all that said and done, we finally arrive at the moment we've all been waiting for. Time for Turnabout Succession. Turnabout Succession is the finale case that dives into the last 7 years of events that lead up to the trial of Vera Misham, who was accused of murdering her father Drew Misham with the poison atropine. The trial of Vera Misham is going to be an interesting one, as it is also the test trial of the jurist system, which is a retest of including jurors in trials once more. In your investigation, you discover that Drew was a forger making fake paintings and a recluse. You find mysterious traces of the poison used in other places of the home, including a frame previously containing a stamp, as well as a letter that was sent 7 years ago from an unknown client. Your argument in court is that Drew died of a poisoned stamp that had been sent to him in the mysterious letter 7 years ago, which was related to the payment of a forgery. But if the client had poisoned the stamp, who was it and why? And if Drew had known the stamp was poisoned and placed it in a frame for 7 years, why would he knowingly use it? Vera is questioned, claiming the forgery from 7 years ago wasn't a replication, but the creation of a journal page that she made. She then faints, having succumbed to atropine poisoning from an unknown source. At this point, we play the trial of the magician Zach Gramar, playing as Phoenix in his last trial. He is given a journal page by Trucy, which he uses as the final piece of evidence to make his case. As soon as it is presented, Drew Misham is brought to the stand to testify that the journal page is a fake that he created, though he can't confirm that Phoenix was his client, as he never met the one making the transaction. When Zach Gramar is to be handed his guilty verdict, he disappears in one last magic trick. You then embark on a hunt as Phoenix to put the pieces together to figure out the what, who, and why of everything that occurred that day. You uncovered that Zach Gramar is alive and escaped with Trucy's help, that Zach Gramar was to inherit performance rights from his master Magnifique Gramar, and that he and Valant were at odds for them. You discover that Vera was the one who created the forgery, and that Drew was the face of the company. Though Drew never met the client, Vera did, and correctly identifies Christoph Gavin as her client for the forgery. You are made aware that Spark Brushel, a witness, has had connections with the Gramar family for a long time, and knows that Trucy's mother has had another child. The Gramar family has a gift to perceive people's behaviours, and Trucy's mother used bracelets to help her see these behaviours. Going back to Vera's trial, the most relevant information is that the true killer of Drew Misham is Christoph. He is called to the stand, and though no decisive evidence can be used to officially link him to the crime, there doesn't need to be any in a trial with a jury. As the trial closes, you are posed as a juror who decides if Vera is guilty or not. Lamioa from the previous case is revealed to be Thalassa Gramar, the mother of Trucy and Apollo, who has regained her memory after getting her sight back and seeing all of Phoenix's investigations for herself, whilst being juror number 6 in Vera's trial. Trucy is given the performance rights of Magnifique Gramar's greatest tricks, and everything seems to be looking upward. There's really no easier way to sum up Turnabout Succession, but with all this in mind, we can continue. For a finale case, the archetype was followed to a T. It stands as a summary of events over the course of 7 years, and if you didn't follow the last 5 minutes of explanation, the case is kind of hard to follow. When first investigating Drew Misham's murder, it isn't obvious who the real killer is, and there is a certain plausibility that Vera is guilty, though the real killer does become apparent as the case continues. Phoenix sees the greatest character development, as the case is central more to him than Apollo, though there really isn't a major arc for most of the major characters in this case, so. The moral test of the case is the jurist system, where we are forced to go against the belief that evidence is everything, and depend on the trial and the jury for everything to work successfully, and for Vera to be declared not guilty. Turnabout Succession is a specific case when it comes to series expectation. By expectation, it is the most important case in the game that wraps up all of the events that have led to this point. Finale cases to this point have a primary villain and include an overarching theme, but it isn't necessarily the culmination of many events. In Turnabout Goodbyes, a central event is the Dios 6 incident, which happened 15 years ago. It was roughly addressed in Turnabout Sisters, though for this case, leaving very little to be known outside of these hints as a decision that works out. In Farewell My Turnabout, the story is self-contained and doesn't need any prelude, so it never includes any. Bridge to the Turnabout follows a long story path, but we have Turnabout Memories and Turnabout Beginnings as bases for what will happen in Bridge to the Turnabout. However, for everything that happens in Turnabout Succession, there is very little alluded to where there could have potentially been more to work with. We are left completely in the dark on the circumstances of Phoenix losing his job, other than he supposedly forged evidence. We know that Shadi Smith ties in somewhere but have no idea how, and we know that Trucy's biological father is either dead or missing. These are the clues for a case that extends 7 years back. The case ends up feeling rushed, trying to include all that it needs to, which is only made worse in the fact that you play 2 trials in one. As I said, you play both the trial of Vera Misham, where you play as Apollo, as well as the trial of Zach Ramar, where you play as Phoenix. In certain ways, having Zach's trial as a separate playable case could have worked as a prelude, where the player is aware of the events that led to the disbarment, but Apollo isn't. In the end, there isn't much alluded to in the former cases, a flaw in their own writing that carries over. One of the greatest subversions presented in the case is the moral challenge created by the jurist system. In the trilogy thus far, it is obvious that there is no jury present in criminal trials for an unknown reason. We are for the first time challenged to go against the ingrained belief in the current system, that decisive evidence is everything. Everyone involved in the trial seems aware of the change. However, until Kristoff's cross-examination in the climax of the case, it doesn't seem to come up much, and there's plenty of mention of needing decisive evidence. It seems most relevant when calling out the villain for attesting the change, but outside of seeing segments from the jury's perspective and this breakdown, it seems otherwise unchallenged. There are other successful subversions in this case, like playing as another character, which is the leaf taken from Trials and Tribulations, where you temporarily play as Edgeworth in Bridge to the Turnabout. There is a canon good and bad ending. In the bad ending, Vera dies of atrocinine poisoning, with a hung jury unable to decide her verdict, but in the good ending, she is acquitted and survives the poisoning. This was also done in Justice for All, where On Guard's verdict determines the outcome of the future. There is also the 2 cases being played at once thing, though, as I've already stated, Zach Ramar's trial could have worked as its own case outstanding of Turnabout Succession. The good and bad ending is effective in showing the gravity of the jury's verdict. However, having Phoenix as a playable character and the second trial come with their own complications, one of which I would like to discuss later. In the end, Turnabout Succession does feel satisfying to complete, but there are many flaws in its writing that come as a repercussion of the previous case's writing. Its subversions are interesting at best, but cause their own problems and inherently tear the case apart at its worst. 7 out of 10, too much confusion. While it's true there are many talking points you can find in analysing the cases of Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, when it comes to formula fiction, there is something else that comes up as a result of this, that can also be analysed for its writing in formula fiction. We're talking characters here. Ace Attorney uses archetypes with its characters as well. Archetyping in characters is by no means used strictly in formula fiction, but when you use recurring storylines, recurring character types is going to keep that familiarity you need, and bolster your series' expectation. Apollo Justice keeps itself in line with these archetypes. The adorable teenage girl is your assistant, the annoying yet lovable prosecutor, unreliable witnesses, whacked out defendants. If these archetypes are indeed working with series expectation positively, there's no need to subvert them. Apollo Justice changed the protagonist. As has been stated, while the main character of Apollo Justice is, well, Apollo Justice, the main character from the previous games is present in this story. Phoenix plays an extremely important role throughout the cases, but there's something about that is just completely wrong. In an attempt to shoehorn Phoenix into the game and make him play an important role, the writers realized a fatal flaw in their work. That being, Apollo and Phoenix read very similarly in their internal dialogue and general personality. They're both presented as rookie attorneys, bright-eyed and just wanting to get a paycheck for their work helping people out. If the writers made Phoenix the same as he was in the previous games, he and Apollo would be completely indistinguishable from each other. To fix this issue, Phoenix was taken in a wholly unexpected direction. He became an apathetic character that is cryptic at the best of times, less than helpful, and an outright jerk. He bullies Apollo and is blunt and sarcastic when it isn't remotely needed. His character becomes almost frustrating to interact with, especially when you compare it to who he used to be. This comes out the worst in Turnabout Succession, when there are segments where you play as Phoenix, and it becomes so obvious that the writers can't choose between writing his original character and the bastardization that he's become. As the writing grows accustomed to writing him in his original state, it suddenly remembers it broke his character and makes some out-of-place remark that throws the player for the loop. The character is assassinated in order to make room for Apollo, and it destroys any positive feeling you were meant to have for Phoenix as a character. It is revealed at the end of the game that he will be likely returning to lore, but after the entire game is spent with him bullying the protagonist and being completely unhelpful, are we just supposed to expect that he'll go back to normal and have to accept that? Even if Phoenix underwent a character arc over the game, is this his conclusion? For him to just revert back to his original character? It all gets worse with age, of course, as Phoenix returns as the titular character of the next game, and he is, as expected, just the same as he was in the trilogy, if not a little bit more mature. Apollo is relegated to playable in a few cases, though he undergoes quite a character shift himself. It was only after Apollo Justice is released that the writers found the flaw in their work, which leads to both Phoenix and Apollo becoming completely inconsistent in their characterization. Apollo becomes an edgelord, which is reasonable if his best friend just died, but you would think they would have brought up him having a best friend? Any other part of his life outside of the courtroom? Somewhere in his own game, if they were going to give him a grief-driven character arc in the very next one. Or, the writers never thought that far ahead and shoehorned in some backstory to define Apollo a little more and to properly differentiate him from Phoenix, but who knows? And Phoenix. Setting aside that it's a character assassination, sure, given the circumstances, Phoenix probably would be apathetic of the law system in the world around him. This will be fine if he didn't immediately revert back to his original character after returning to the courtroom. The only remnants of Phoenix's 7 years spent jobless are him making poker puns. We aren't going to keep any of that characterization, huh? There is potential in how Phoenix acts that could be carried over from Apollo Justice, yet it's just dropped. We get the lovable man back, but at the cost of disregarding his entire character for an entire game. It was an assassination. Now forget about it, because he's the main character again. There's nothing more to it. To subvert series expectation, Apollo was introduced as a new protagonist, and Phoenix's character was downright slandered in order to keep the two characters distinct. With the continuation of the series, Phoenix returned as the protagonist, once more, and then both were destroyed again to keep Phoenix familiar to how he was in the trilogy, and to give Apollo a backstory that they would have never otherwise introduced. Now sure, the atrocious writing of Phoenix and Apollo here is a result of subversion, but as I said in the character intro, most of the characters are true to their archetypes and stick to series expectation. There isn't much to analyze about characters that do their work in their context. Now, I've spent roughly 12 pages of a script slandering a game for following formula fiction and subverting series expectation to prevent stagnation. Surely that's it. Surely it's always a failure, and there is nothing to say that it works sometimes. Except it works sometimes. Every game has a token villain, the big bad you face off against in the final case. In Phoenix Wright, it's Von Karma, who killed Gregory Edgeworth 15 years ago for ruining his perfect record, and then decided to destroy Miles Edgeworth by getting him declared guilty for a crime he never commit. In Justice for All, it's Matt Ongard, who hired a hitman on his biggest rival in the acting industry, not only for that rivalry, but also for the messy demise of Celeste Impacts, which Corita was going to expose Ongard of. In Trials and Tribulations, it's Dahlia Hawthorne. A woman built on pure evil, Dahlia has a high body count and was willing to do anything and kill anyone to get her way. Three are presented as evil, out of their minds with their motives. Murder for one penalty on a record? For someone trying to out you as an awful person for just getting your way? We aren't meant to relate to them or like them, and in a way we aren't meant to see them as realistic either. Von Karma is described as a demon prosecutor, and he kept a bullet in his shoulder for 15 years. Ongard is two-faced and so narcissistic it hurts. Dahlia comes back from the dead in Bridge to the Turnabout for crying out loud. In the end, they're characters. Characters we're meant to hate, but characters nonetheless. But the villain of Apollo Justice is written disturbingly realistically. The central villain of Apollo Justice is Christoph Gavin, who I mentioned earlier was also your mentor in the tutorial case. I'm going to say it outright, Christoph is written as a mimic of real-life serial killers. This choice in writing is exceedingly well done. It holds no bars writing a villain that stands out from the roster of big bads, and creates a villain that could exist in our own world, which is scarier than any demon prosecutor or homicidal ghost. There are two major things that help build this character in such a way: personality and intention. Some of the big-name murderers around the place have something in common. They're either openly hated by their community, or they're extremely charismatic. Some of the most notorious serial killers are notorious simply because you would never suspect them. All anyone has to say about them is that they're a good person who's open in conversation and likable all around. They could never do that. Many of their victims trusted them completely only to wind up dead. This is a trait that Christoph bears from the beginning. We are meant to trust him after all. In your first interactions with him, he is overly honest and condescending in a way that comes off as weirdly charming. While in court, he often gives tips and reminders, and even when acting somewhat passive-aggressive, maintains a calm composure. We are meant to see him as someone who is notoriously trustworthy and outwardly friendly. Hell, even after his arrest, when talking to Phoenix, he maintains a particular persona, approachable and honest to a fault. Despite knowing the wrong he's done, he has a reputation and intends to keep it. It's only when he's under pressure that this facade starts to break, where he grows more and more aggressive to anyone who goes against his word. Something else that sticks out about many serial killers in real life is strong duality, much like in personalities. There was either no motive or an extremely complicated one. Either they take whoever they could find, or went after people that met a criteria. Weirdly enough, there's a bit of both when it comes to Christoph, though it goes back the full 7 years. In the case of Shardy Smith, we at first have no idea what his motive is. This is even stated in a note in Turnabout Succession. Though we can later interpret that he knew Shardy Smith was actually Zach Ramah, and even though they only saw each other a moment passing by, that was enough. Zach, who had disappeared roughly 7 years ago, was suddenly back, and if Christoph were unlucky, Zach would likely talk to Phoenix, and who knows what mess would come of it from there. So the decision was made, and Zach was murdered. In the case of Drew Misham, it was a murder 7 years in the making, a precaution so as to never be found out. Christoph went through the Mishams for forged evidence to be used in a trial, and to keep them quiet, gave them a means by which would keep them silent on the subject permanently. He gifted poisoned nail polish to a girl who would likely chew off her nails in her nervousness, and a poisoned stamp that would need to be licked to be used to send a letter. No one could hear them confess their client's name if they were both dead. Only Vera took the stamp, saving Drew of using it for 7 years, and Vera never left the house, so she was never nervous enough to chew her nails. Christoph laid his plans out that it would work, though, of course, there was a 7-year delay, and at that point, how could anyone call him the criminal? In both cases, it's calculated, thought out, and there's a specific motive behind it. There's just one thing that makes no sense in it all, and it stems from the source. Why did he forge evidence? If he had forged the evidence when he found out Phoenix would replace him in the trial of Zach Ramah, Vera would have only had 1 night to complete the forgery, which is too little time. Christoph wasn't plotting Phoenix's downfall from the start, that doesn't seem to be the case at least. That means he had it forged prior, but for what reason? Did he really think his client was guilty and went so far to forge to acquit him? Given his reputation, it's possible this is a habit, but then how many more forgers has he killed that we don't know about? We know that Clavier was the prosecutor in the trial. Did Christoph try to guarantee his win just to spite his younger brother? There are many theories you can throw at as to why, but in the end, he tipped off his brother that forged evidence would appear in the trial, handed it off to Trucy, who handed it off to Phoenix, who would inevitably show the evidence to support his case, unknowing of what the truth was, and he would lose his badge as a result. The duality is created with no apparent motive for the forgery, but all subsequent actions taking careful calculations in the name of self-preservation. These traits can't be boasted by any other Ace Attorney villain, so the subversive element there has been nailed on the head. Yet the realism of someone you trust turning out to be completely deranged turns a character with interesting writing into a person we fear. The terrifying notion that someone like him exists is what gets us. Of course, though the realistic elements of his character are a notable subversion, there's something else that lends itself to subversion in his writing, that being his conviction. In his breakdown, he is disgusted at the thought of jurors swaying the verdict. Decisive evidence is the only thing that should sway a verdict. It's all there is room for in a court of law. People and their feelings shouldn't be allowed to find someone guilty or not. As we know, the entire finale case is built on the exact opposite premise, that the court system is stagnant and corrupted, that there is an advantage on the prosecution's side, and there is something crucial missing from every trial: common sense. At the end of the trial, the judge is not the singular being handing down the verdict. A jury of 6 deliberate to make the decision, no decisive evidence technically needed. And everyone involved in the case, Apollo, Clavia the judge, know the importance of the jury system's test, know it's a step in the right direction for the future of law. Everyone except Kristoff, of course. The first defense attorney to be villainized is one that accepts no change in the system, that has no flexibility in his thinking, and is ultimately broken by his own stagnation, and people's abilities to call him out on it. In all finale cases, a moral is challenged in the protagonist, and for us, he is the one challenging it, by simultaneously despising the change, yet helping to spur it. Kristoff Gavin is a villain created out of fear of stagnation, a villain that needed to have something completely different to what we've seen before, and they nailed it. There are many flaws in Apollo Justice where subversions have been made, and while Kristoff isn't without fault, he stands out as a shining example of why subversion in formula fiction will continue to be used. Because no, subversions don't always work the way you intended them to, but when they work, they get the job done. Series can make 100 failed subversions if it means that one of them will stand above the rest. Apollo Justice Ace Attorney is the 4th installment in an ongoing series that subscribes to formula fiction. The game makes a variety of subversive changes in order to keep the series from falling into stagnation, whilst complying with the formula set for it to comply with. Many of these changes work well and make for an entertaining story, but at the same time, many of the changes don't work well, and then the game suffers for it. The individual cases are enjoyable, but the overarching story is left to rot by a controversial choice of case archetypes. There are many writing choices that feel weird, out of place, or shoehorned into the game, which hurts its replayability and enjoyability therefore. Elements feel convoluted and out of character, making its place in the middle of the series out of place. Apollo Justice is also the game with the strongest impact on the flow of the rest of the series. It holds significance for the continuation of the story, and unfortunately, writing flaws in this game carry forward, creating complications in the rest of the series. There are many issues with the cycle that comes with formula fiction, but never forget that there are 2 sides to every coin. A series can create its own downfall of subversion, or it can benefit from it greatly. While Ace Attorney is an example of complications arising from its continuation, a series isn't necessarily destined to fall from grace for using formula fiction. A single analysis video isn't going to stop formula fiction's use, nor is that the intention here. There is danger in the concept, but at the same time, merit. Undeniably, the familiarity created by formula fiction unites games and series, and is something a player can fall back on and expect. There are writing opportunities that arise from creating subversive characters, scenarios, game mechanics, and it's admittedly what keeps any series running. Ace Attorney started as a beauty, and after creating its series expectation, has fallen, yet that's not to say this spells the end. Formula fiction has the potential to create something so much better, something new that would overturn the series and place it right back into the spotlight. In mythology, the phoenix is a bird that dies in a flurry of ashes, but is reborn from the carnage stronger than before. I find it ironic for a series with a main character named Phoenix that it would not inevitably do the same. I think a saying could sum it up quite well. You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame. How could you rise anew if you had not first become ashes?